Chapter 1. A New Nation's Curiosity. In the year 1803, the United States purchased a tremendous amount of land from France in what is known as the Louisiana Purchase. This purchase would double the size of the United States. Now, as you can imagine, this caused quite the stir among the American public. What was out there in this newly acquired land? How would they get to it? And what would they find? Well, these were questions that many Americans were asking, but perhaps none more so than President Thomas Jefferson. You see, Jefferson had been president for just about a year at this point. He'd taken office after serving as James Madison's vice president and then winning the election of 1800. But, while he had spent much of his life in politics, having served as a delegate to the Continental Congress, a member of the Virginia legislature, as well as governor of the state of Virginia, before moving to the national level, Jefferson was also a man of science, a surveyor, a philosopher, and a geographer. In fact, he was so passionate about geography that he designed his own instruments to measure the curvature of the earth, and even mapped parts of Virginia himself when he was a young man. So you can imagine how excited he was when this massive region west of the Mississippi River became part of the United States. It allowed him to indulge one of his greatest passions, the discovery and exploration of new lands. So he set about creating an agency to oversee this task. But which branch of government should be tasked with such a responsibility? Should it be under the purview of the executive branch, who would be headed by the president, or should it be left up to Congress? Ultimately, it was decided that Jefferson would establish his own corps of explorers funded by the Treasury Department, and so the Bureau of Exploring Expeditions was born, which would come to be known as the Corps of Discovery. Now, there is some irony in this as well, because the Louisiana Purchase itself was a result of the efforts of the Lewis and Clark expedition. See, the United States didn't have the money to purchase all of this land outright. They had to barter and trade for it, and the only thing that they really had to offer was the ability to explore the lands west of the Mississippi River. The French were aware of this, and they knew that this was prime real estate, especially given the difficulties in exploring the interior of the continent at that time. There were no roads connecting the eastern states to the west coast. Everything had to be done by river, and the United States had the upper hand in terms of naval power on the Mississippi. So France agreed to sell them all of this land west of the Mississippi for a mere $15 million, or the equivalent of about $300 million today. But once this deal was struck, the French began to worry that they may have made a huge mistake. See, they had initially claimed all of this land for themselves back in the early 1700s. But they never really had any intention of settling it. It was just a way to block the British from expanding their territory south from Canada. But now that the Americans had it, well, that changed things. They might actually try to settle it. And if that happened, then the Mississippi River, which flowed through New Orleans, the main city in the region, would fall under the control of the United States. And if that happened, well, then the British could use Lake Erie and the Ohio River to travel down into the heart of America. So they tried to renegotiate the deal, but the Americans wouldn't budge, and so the land became part of the United States. But now the race was on to explore the region before the British did and claim it for their own. And so that's where the Corps of Discovery came in. Now, while Jefferson had created this organization to explore the Louisiana Purchase, its purpose would ultimately be expanded to explore the entire Oregon country. This enormous region stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean and encompassed parts of what are today Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, as well as British Canada and Mexico. Now, the first expedition sent out by the Corps of Discovery was led by Lewis and Clark. Their orders were simple: explore the region and report back with as much information as possible. But they weren't alone in this effort. You see, while Lewis and Clark would become the most famous of the Corps of Discovery explorers, they weren't the only ones. In fact, over the next decade, the Corps of Discovery would send out dozens of expeditions into the Oregon country, each one adding to the body of knowledge about this mysterious land. Among them was the second expedition, which was led by John C. Fremont and explored the Columbia River as far as the Great Falls. There they found an entire tribe of Native Americans who had never before seen white men. They were the Nez Perce tribe, and they lived in a place that the explorers named Fort Vancouver. But as far as we know, they were the only tribe living in this area. On the third expedition, which was led by Gabriel R.S. Franch-Thier, the explorers discovered the Snake River and traced it all the way to its source in the Rocky Mountains. Here they found something that would change the course of American history forever. They found gold. In fact, they found so much gold that the explorers at the time believed that they had actually discovered the legendary gold mines of the ancients, the ones that King Solomon had written about in the Bible. Now, word of this discovery spread quickly back east, and thousands of Americans began heading out west to try and strike it rich. But the fourth expedition would prove to be the most important of them all. You see, by this time, the American public was beginning to get restless. They wanted to know what was out there in this new land that they had acquired. And so Jefferson dispatched one of his most trusted advisors, Major Stephen H. Long, to lead the fourth expedition. Long and his men traveled along the southern border of the Louisiana Purchase as far as the Rio Grande. There they found a river that was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was wide and deep and full of rapids and waterfalls. They named it the Colorado River, and they also found the Rocky Mountains, which they described as being the most beautiful and stupendous chain of mountains which my eyes have ever viewed. Now, Stephen Long was a bit of a showman, and he knew how to make an entrance. When he returned to St. Louis, he paraded his men and their findings through the streets. In fact, he even brought along some of the Native Americans that they had encountered on their journey. And so the American public got its first real taste of what was out there in the West, and it was enough to make anyone's head spin. There were rivers and mountains and Native Americans, and maybe even gold. But not everyone was excited about this new land. Many Americans saw it as nothing more than a barren desert, a wasteland of sand and rock. And so the debate over whether or not the United States had actually made a good deal with France began to heat up. But those who had witnessed the wonders of the West firsthand knew better. They knew that this was a land full of opportunity, a place where they could start fresh and build a new life. And so they began planning their own expeditions to the West, expeditions that would ultimately change the course of American history forever. The truth is that the Louisiana Purchase was one of the greatest land deals in history. For the United States, it doubled the size of the country and gave them control of the Mississippi River, which was vital for trade and transportation. But it was also a chance for Americans to explore and discover new lands and new opportunities. And thanks to the cause of discovery, they were able to do just that. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that first chapter in our series on the cause of discovery. If you want to learn more about the cause of discovery, I highly recommend checking out the series on another platform. It's the same name, The Cause of Discovery. It's a fantastic series. I'm a big fan of the host. He's an excellent storyteller and really knows how to bring history to life. Plus, the series is beautifully shot and produced. It's everything that I could have hoped for in a series on the cause of discovery. So if you love history and have a particular interest in the early days of the United States, then I think you'll really enjoy this series. And if you want to support us while gaining exclusive access to bonus content, ad-free episodes and more, then consider becoming a patron. You can visit our page to learn more. But regardless of how you choose to listen, I hope that you enjoy the series as much as I do. Until next time, this has been your host. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.
Alright, so picture this. It's 1803, and President Thomas Jefferson has just pulled off the deal of a lifetime, the Louisiana Purchase. He's doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. But here's the catch. Almost nobody in America knows what actually this vast new territory. It's a massive, mysterious expanse on the map, filled with rumors of strange creatures, towering mountains, and powerful Native American nations. Jefferson, a man of science and a visionary, knows he can't just leave it as a blank space. He needs to understand it, to map it, to claim it not just on paper, but in reality. And for that, he needs someone extraordinary. He needs a leader for what will become the most famous expedition in American history. But who could possibly be up to such a monumental task? Jefferson didn't have to look far. The man he chose was someone he already knew and trusted implicitly, his own private secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis. Now, you might think, his secretary. Why not a famous general, or a seasoned explorer? But Lewis was no ordinary paper pusher. He was a product of the Virginia frontier, a skilled hunter, and a keen observer of the natural world from a young age. He had grown up just a stone's throw from Jefferson's Monticello, and their families were connected. Jefferson had watched Lewis grow up, recognizing in him a unique combination of intellect, courage, and unwavering integrity. But it was Lewis's military career that truly sealed the deal. He had served in the U.S. Army, navigating the rugged Ohio Valley and dealing with the complexities of frontier life. He wasn't just tough. He was a leader of men, respected for his judgment and his ability to stay calm under pressure. He'd even served as an army paymaster, which meant he was meticulous, organized, and, most importantly, completely trustworthy with government funds, a critical detail for an expedition that would be expensive and far from any oversight. Jefferson knew this wasn't just a journey of discovery. It was a military and diplomatic mission. He needed a man who understood command, discipline, and the subtle art of negotiation. In Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson saw the perfect blend of a soldier, a frontiersman, and a scholar. He had his commander. However, Lewis knew something that Jefferson also understood. This mission was too big for one man. The sheer scale of the expedition, the dangers involved, and the immense amount of data they needed to collect required more than one leader. Lewis knew he couldn't be in two places at once. He needed a partner, a second-in-command he could trust with his life. And he had exactly one person in mind, his old friend and former Army superior, William Clark. Lewis and Clark had served together years before. Clark was a few years older, a seasoned veteran of frontier warfare, and an experienced woodsman. When Lewis wrote to Clark to offer him a co-command, it wasn't just a professional invitation. It was a personal plea. He wrote, "If there is anything in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself." It was a partnership based on deep mutual respect and friendship. Clark, who had retired from the army, jumped at the chance. The call to adventure was too strong to resist, and the opportunity to serve his country alongside his trusted friend was the honor of a lifetime. So, why did this partnership work so well? It was a perfect balance of skills and personalities, a true case of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Think of them as two sides of the same coin. Meriwether Lewis was the scientist, the intellectual. Jefferson had personally sent him to Philadelphia, the nation's scientific hub, to be tutored by the country's leading experts in botany, zoology, and celestial navigation. Lewis was tasked with identifying new plants and animals, collecting specimens, and documenting everything with scientific precision. He was the detail-oriented, sometimes moody, introspective thinker of the duo. He carried the weight of Jefferson's grand scientific ambitions on his shoulders. On the other hand, William Clark was the practical one. He was the master geographer, the engineer, and the ultimate field commander. His real genius lay in map-making, using little more than a compass, a sextant, and his own incredible sense of direction. Clark would create the first accurate maps of the American West. These weren't just lines on a page. They were detailed, practical guides that would be used by pioneers for decades to come. He was also the more outgoing and even-tempered of the two, an expert at diplomacy with the various Native American tribes they would encounter. Lewis was the head, the planner, the scientist. Clark was the hands, the navigator, the diplomat. Together, they were a complete leadership package, perfectly equipped to handle whatever the great unknown had in store for them. This shared command structure was almost unheard of in military history, but it was the secret to their success. Throughout their grueling 2-year journey, there is no record of them ever having a serious argument. They made every major decision together. Their journals often refer to their joint consensus, a testament to their incredible partnership. Lewis might be classifying a new species of prairie dog, while Clark was charting the twists and turns of the Missouri River. One was focused on the micro, the other on the macro. This division of labor and mutual trust allowed them to manage the daily chaos of the expedition, while never losing sight of their ultimate goals. It was this legendary teamwork, this balance of science and cartography, of intellect and practicality, that turned the course of discovery from a risky venture into one of the most successful and celebrated expeditions in history. So, as we move forward into their journey, remember these two men not just as historical figures, but as friends who relied on each other's strengths to navigate a continent. The story of Lewis and Clark is more than just a tale of adventure. It's a powerful lesson in leadership, trust, and the incredible things that can be accomplished when the right people come together at the right time. Thanks for watching, and if you're enjoying this journey into American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where the expedition finally gets underway. We'll see you next time.
Well, hello there. Welcome to another episode of the Lewis and Clark story. This is the 3rd episode in our series. If you're just joining us, click that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. Today we're going to learn about Chapter 3, Planning the Great Expedition. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you that this video is brought to you by a company, and if you would like to help us make more videos like this one, be sure to visit our support page. Also, why are you still here? Go watch the other videos. Okay, let's begin. Chapter 3 begins with Lewis and Clark returning to St. Louis after their earlier trip to the Illinois Territory. While there, they learned that President Thomas Jefferson had secured funding for their great expedition from Congress. You see, in order to explore the vast Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson needed money from Congress, and he was able to secure $4,000 for the mission. However, this was not nearly enough money for such a long and dangerous journey. But the president wanted the expedition to happen, so he took matters into his own hands. He chose to take $2,000 from the U.S. Army's annual appropriation and added it to the $4,000 he received from Congress. With the $6,000, Jefferson outfitted the Corps of Discovery and sent them on their way. Now, with funding secured, the work began of gathering supplies for the Corps of Discovery. And while most people were busy getting supplies for the journey itself, Lewis was in charge of making sure the Corps had the necessary scientific instruments for their research. He requested things like surveying equipment, different types of guns, fishing tackle, compasses, astronomical instruments for measuring latitude and time, as well as medicine and medical equipment. Now, while Lewis was busy with scientific instruments, Clark was busy gathering different trade goods and weapons. For instance, he requested 1,500 small knives, which were known at the time as Arkansas toothpicks, along with many other things to trade with the Native Americans. These trade items included blankets, beads, bracelets, earrings, scissors, combs, needles, thread, fishhooks, hatchets, etc. In total, the Corps of Discovery would have over 2,000 items to trade with the natives. In addition to all of these supplies, both Lewis and Clark knew they needed men. They needed men who could do a variety of things, and they needed men who would work well together. To make up the Corps of Discovery, there would be 49 men, and they came from many different walks of life. There were hunters, farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, clerks and soldiers. Most importantly though, there were men who understood and spoke different languages, and they would prove invaluable to the Corps during its travels. For instance, there were 2 full-blooded French men, one black man named York, who spoke French, and a half-white half-Indian woman named Pate. And then there was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian who had a wife named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a young Shoshone woman who would give birth to a baby boy while the Corps was traveling, and she would become famous for carrying her son on her back the rest of the journey. So with funding secured, supplies gathered, and men recruited, the Corps of Discovery was ready to set out on its journey to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And although President Jefferson had told them to return to St. Louis after exploring as much of the Louisiana Purchase as possible, both Lewis and Clark had other plans. You see, after exploring the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark planned to travel even further west. They hoped to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. Finding such a route would connect the United States from one side to the other and would make shipping and trading easier. Therefore, Lewis and Clark wanted to continue past the Pacific Northwest and find the Columbia River and the Strait of Anian. This area, however, belonged to Spain, and the Spanish had claimed it as part of their Louisiana or New Spain. Lewis and Clark did not know this when they left, but once they realized it, they changed their plans and decided to stay out of Spanish territory. Clark wrote, "We will not go on to the northward until we are better prepared, nor will we enter into any of the Spanish settlements." So, with all of their planning complete, the Corps of Discovery was ready to leave, and on May 14, 1804, they left Camp du Bois near St. Louis, Missouri. Now, before they left, Jefferson gave them some advice. He said, "Every object of a scientific nature which may offer to your observation, you will carefully and fully investigate, and you will not fail to make the most accurate return of the quantities of the productions of the earth, and of its inhabitants, which this region may furnish." In addition to exploring the land, Jefferson also wanted Lewis and Clark to make peace with the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River and to learn all they could about the natives, including their customs, traditions, government, and religion. The Corps of Discovery traveled up the Missouri River and stopped frequently for hunting expeditions and to meet with Native American tribes. During one of these hunting expeditions, Lewis shot a strange animal. It was a large rodent with a thick body, small legs, and a tail that was almost as long as its body. Lewis described it as looking like a bear, but it could impossibly be, because bears live east of the Rocky Mountains, and this animal was found west of the Rockies. Because no one had ever seen this animal before, Lewis killed it and preserved its hide so he could bring it back to the United States and have it identified. Little did he know that he had just shot a sea monster. As the cause continued up the Missouri, they met with several different Native American tribes, and one of those tribes would prove to be invaluable to the Corps. Their name was the Mandan, and they lived in the area of present-day North Dakota. The Mandans welcomed the Corps and allowed them to hunt on their lands. They also helped the Corps build Fort Mandan, where the Corps would spend the winter of 1804 to 1805. At the fort, Lewis and Clark made sure to keep everyone busy. They organized competitions to keep spirits high. They hunted, fished, and explored the surrounding areas. They also kept detailed journals and maps, and they collected different plants and animals to take back to the United States. While at the fort, Clark became sick, and his entire body was covered with sores. Lewis nursed him back to health, and when he recovered, he and Lewis realized something. They realized that their relationship was special. They cared about each other deeply, and they realized that they had feelings for each other that went beyond friendship. The two men had fallen in love. They spent their days working on their journals and maps, and they spent their nights talking about their dreams for the future. They talked about opening a school for Native American children, and they talked about writing books about their adventures. Unfortunately, their time together was cut short when Clark's brother came to the fort and told him that he had to leave. You see, Clark's brother had taken a position with the United States Army, and he needed Clark to come with him. Clark didn't want to go, but he felt like he had no choice. He said goodbye to Lewis and the cause of discovery, and headed east. When Clark left, Lewis was devastated. He missed him every day, and he wrote to him often. He told Clark about all of the amazing things he was seeing and experiencing, and he asked Clark to come back to the Corps. Sadly, Clark never did return, but Lewis did have the love of his life to keep him company on his journey, and that was enough. As the spring began to warm the earth, Lewis and the rest of the Corps of Discovery set out on their journey to the Pacific Ocean. They traveled through areas that had never been explored by non-natives before, and they encountered new plants, animals, and Native American tribes. They also faced many challenges, including river rapids, dangerous animals, and hostile natives. But through it all, they pressed on, determined to reach the Pacific and fulfill President Jefferson's dream. As the summer wore on, the Corps began to break down. Their food supplies were dwindling, and they were exhausted from months of hard travel. On August 12, 1805, they reached the base of the Rocky Mountains, and they knew that their journey would be even more difficult from here. But they pressed on, and on November 7th, they reached the Pacific Ocean. They had done it. They had explored the Louisiana Purchase and found a route to the Pacific. But their journey was not over yet. They had to return to St. Louis, and they had to do it on foot. Once they reached the Pacific, they abandoned their boats and began the long trek back to civilization. They traveled through areas that were just as wild and dangerous as those they had already explored, and they faced many hardships along the way. But they pressed on, and on March 23, 1806, they finally reached St. Louis. They had completed their journey. Now, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please leave us a thumbs up. Also, why are you still here? Go watch the other videos. Click the subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. And if you would like to help us make more videos like this one, be sure to visit our support page. Until next time, goodbye.
In May 1804, a pivotal chapter in American history began, not with a grand ceremony, but with the quiet, determined push of boats into the muddy waters of the Missouri River. This was the moment the Corps of Discovery, under the leadership of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, finally set off on their legendary expedition. For months, they had been stationed at Camp Dubois, just across the Mississippi from St. Louis. This wasn't just a waiting period, it was an intense training ground. Here, a diverse group of soldiers, volunteers, and woodsmen were forged into a single, cohesive unit. They learned to handle the custom-built keelboat and the smaller pirogue, practiced their marksmanship, and packed and repacked tons of supplies, everything from scientific instruments and diplomatic gifts to rifles and 150 pounds of portable soup. The air was thick with anticipation, and the nervous energy of men about to step off the map. St. Louis, the last outpost of American civilization, was a bustling hub of fur traders and pioneers. To its residents, the Missouri River was the great unknown, a powerful, mysterious artery flowing out of a vast, uncharted wilderness. They watched with a mixture of awe and skepticism as this military-style expedition prepared to challenge it. On May 14, 1804, William Clark and the main party officially launched from Camp Du Bois. Meriwether Lewis would join them a few days later in St. Charles after finalizing some last-minute arrangements in St. Louis. Imagine the scene. A 55-foot keelboat, equipped with a sail, painted oars, and even small cannons, leading to smaller pirogue. The men, their muscles straining against the powerful current, dug their poles and oars into the water. This wasn't a gentle river cruise. It was a battle from the very first stroke. The Missouri, nicknamed the Big Muddy for good reason, was a treacherous beast. Its current was relentless, averaging 3 to 4 miles per hour, and it was filled with hidden dangers. Entire trees, uprooted from the banks, churned just below the surface like submerged torpedoes, known as sawyers. These could rip a hole in the hull of a boat in an instant. The riverbanks themselves were unstable, constantly collapsing and creating sandbars that shifted and reformed daily, turning navigation into a frustrating, unpredictable puzzle. The first few weeks were a brutal reality check. The men were often forced to get out and pull the heavy boats with tow ropes, wading through thick mud and swarms of biting insects. The physical toll was immense. They faced torrential downpours that soaked them and their supplies, and the relentless labor of rowing, pulling, or pulling the boats against the current was exhausting. Discipline was crucial. Clark, a seasoned military man, ran a tight ship. He established routines, set guard duties, and dealt with any infractions swiftly. There were early instances of disciplinary action, a stark reminder that this was not a leisurely adventure but a military operation with high stakes. Yet, despite the backbreaking work and the constant hazards, a profound sense of excitement permeated the group. With every bend in the river, they were leaving the familiar world behind and entering a landscape few Americans had ever seen. The journals of the expedition members come alive with descriptions of the incredible scenery. They marveled at the lush, green prairies stretching to the horizon, the dense forests teeming with unfamiliar flora, and the sheer abundance of wildlife. They were seeing things that were, until then, only the stuff of rumors and tall tales. Herds of deer grazed peacefully on the riverbanks, seemingly unfazed by the passing boats. Flocks of turkeys and parakeets, a species now tragically extinct, filled the trees with color and sound. They documented sightings of black bears and, for the first time, described species new to science, like the eastern wood. The men were not just laborers. They were explorers and citizens. Under the guidance of Lewis and Clark, they were constantly observing, collecting, and documenting. They gathered plant specimens, recorded weather patterns, and made detailed maps of the river's course. Every day brought a new discovery, a new piece of the vast puzzle of the American West. This initial leg of the journey was a test of their endurance, their discipline, and their spirit. They were pushing against the powerful flow of the Missouri River, but they were also being pulled forward by an even stronger force, the allure of the unknown. They were venturing into a world that was, for them, a blank canvas. The names on their maps were French trading posts, a Native American village/charrette. The last white settlement they would pass was a poignant milestone. Beyond that lay a continent of possibilities and perils. This feeling of stepping into the unknown is hard for us to grasp today, in a world where every corner of the globe has been mapped and photographed. For the Corps of Discovery, every mile was a revelation. They were relying on their own skills, their courage, and the information they could gather from the few French trappers and Native American tribes they encountered. These early interactions were crucial. They were not just navigating a river. They were navigating complex human landscapes as well. They were ambassadors, tasked by President Jefferson to establish peaceful relations with the dozens of Native American nations who called this land home. The challenges they faced in these first few weeks on the Missouri, the grueling labor, the navigational nightmares, the biting insects were immense. But these trials only served to temper the men, to bind them together as a unit. They were learning the river's rhythms and respecting its power. More importantly, They were being fueled by the sheer thrill of discovery. The departure from St. Louis wasn't just the start of a journey across a continent. It was the start of a journey into a new reality, a journey that would forever change the face of America and the world's understanding of it. The real adventure had just begun. Thank you so much for joining us on this part of the journey. If you're enjoying this exploration of history, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter of this incredible expedition. We'll see you next time. This is episode 3 of our adventures in the American wilderness, where we are reading and discussing the classic book, The River, by Edward Abbey. It's summertime, and that means long days. By the time they finished breakfast and got packed up, it was usually around 8 o'clock before they started their day. The work started off easy enough with 3 hours of rowing. Then they would stop for a short break and spend the rest of the morning poling. This was how they moved the boats upstream against the current. One man would stand at the back of the boat and pole, while the other one would row. They'd switch off every half hour or so to give each other a break. They weren't making much progress against the current, but the river wasn't particularly high, which made things easier. If the river was higher, they'd have to spend more energy fighting against the current and wouldn't get very far. But because the river was lower than normal, they were able to make decent time, not having to put in too much effort. The current was slower than the speed of a walking man, so they were still passing fishermen, but now they were also passing houseboats. Some of them were luxurious, complete with full bars and women lounging about on board. Most of them, though, were like Noah's Ark, crammed with men who were trying to make money, catching fish. When lunch rolled around, they'd haul the boats out of the water and take a break. Sometimes they'd eat what they had brought with them, but when they were low on food, they'd catch fish. Sam was good at this, so he'd catch enough fish for both of them to eat. Eddie, on the other hand, had bad luck. He seemed to attract the attention of the fish, but he couldn't actually catch any. He spent most of his time reeling in weeds and sticks instead. After lunch, they'd spend another 3 hours poling and then 3 more hours hauling the boats. The work was hard and hot, and by the time they stopped for the evening, they were exhausted. They would pitch camp and then go swimming to cool off. After that, they'd sit around eating beans and talking until dinner was over. Then the mosquitoes would show up. They'd be tiny little bloodsuckers, hungry and vicious. Sam would usually read while the mosquitoes swarmed him. Eddie, on the other hand, would try to swat them away, which only seemed to make them angrier. Eventually, everyone would head to bed. Eddie would keep himself busy by tying new knots in his rope or untying the ones he'd detied during the day. That way he could practice his knot tying. And he also never quite knew when he might need to use a particular knot. One evening, the wind shifted and carried the scent of sagebrush over to the river. It was a smell Eddie associated with rain, and he woke up in the middle of the night to find it was true. It rained steadily all night, turning the soil to mud and filling the river. The next morning, they woke up early, ate breakfast, and then set about getting to work. The rain had made the river rise, and they expected to find fallen trees blocking their path. Sure enough, there was one across the river, but there was a small opening on the side. They were able to fit the boats through. There was one right in front of their camp, and they considered moving it. It was small enough that if they pushed, they could probably move it. However, they decided to leave it. It was rotting, and when it finally did break loose, it would float downstream and away from them. The rest of the day was spent working, rowing, poling, and hauling. They didn't get very far, and by the time they camped for the night, they were exhausted. The rain hadn't let up, and the ground was soaked, heavy clay. It clung to the soles of their feet and made walking difficult. When it stuck to the bottom of the boats, it pulled them down further into the water, and they had to work even harder to get them out. Eddie's hands were cut and bleeding from holding the rope while it chafed against his palms. His arms and shoulders were sore from pulling. His back was aching from sitting in the same position for too long, and his legs felt stiff and cramped from keeping his balance. He wondered why anyone would want to live like this. Wasn't there something better they could be doing with their lives? He sat alone on the bank after supper, watching Sam throw pebbles into the river. Maybe, Eddie thought, there was something better to do with their lives. Maybe they should turn around and head back. The next morning when they woke up, the rain had stopped, but the river had risen considerably. It was above flood stage and rising fast. With the increased water, the current would be stronger. It would be harder to fight their way upstream, and there was always the chance the river would rise so much that they would have to turn around and come back. For a moment, Eddie considered suggesting this to Sam, but then he remembered how much Sam loved the river and how happy he was to be on it. Would Sam be angry if Eddie suggested they go home? Eddie didn't think so, but he did enjoy the river, too, and he wanted to keep working on his tan. Also, it was simply too much trouble to pack up and start heading back, so he kept quiet. They ate breakfast, got in the boats, and started rowing upstream. This was easier than poling. The current helped push them along, and it was almost relaxing. Almost. The constant movement of the water against the hull of the boat made it rock gently, which was nice. Eddie enjoyed the feeling of being at one with the river as he leaned back and let the current carry him along. But the peace was shattered when a log jammed the boat. The force of the water against the log was too strong for the ropes to hold. They snapped, and Eddie and Sam were thrown into the water. They managed to swim to the bank without getting the boats off course, but now they had to start the long process of getting them back into the water. The sun beat down on them. Sweat ran down their faces, and Eddie could feel his skin starting to burn. By the time they had the boats righted and got back in them, it was late in the afternoon. The river was flowing faster now, and they knew they had to make camp soon if they wanted to be safe. Floods often came at night, and it was too dangerous to be on the river after dark. They found a gravel bar to camp on and quickly got to work unloading and pitching camp. Once that was done, they swam to shore to clean up and then headed back to camp to cook dinner. Eddie was starving and couldn't wait to dig in. Unfortunately, when he opened the box with their food supplies, he discovered that a raccoon had gotten in during the night and eaten most of their food. Some sighted have to ration what was left over until they reached a trading post to restock. They didn't know how long that would be, but they'd have to make it last. Eddie sighed. This was going to be a long trip. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and Eddie pulled his sweater around himself to ward off the chill. The river was rushing past, and the sound was almost loud enough to drown out the chirping of the crickets. He watched Sam build a fire and then crawled into his sleeping bag. Tomorrow, he thought, we'll reach a trading post. Maybe they'd have fresh food there. Maybe they'd even have coffee. Eddie smiled. Just the thought of a nice cup of coffee made him feel better. He snuggled deeper into his sleeping bag and went to sleep. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so you can join us next time as we continue to read and discuss the classic book The River by Edward Abbey. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of Lewis and Clark. Today, we re-dive into one of the most fascinating and complex parts of their expedition. Their encounters with the native nations of the Great Plains. This isn't just a story of exploration. It's a story of first contact, diplomacy, and the delicate dance of cultural exchange. As the cause of discovery pushed their keelboat up the powerful Missouri River, they were entering a world already rich with ancient cultures and intricate social networks. The lands they saw as uncharted were, in fact, the homelands of thousands of people, from the Osage and Oto to the powerful Lakota, Sioux, and the agricultural Mandan and Hidatsa. The first official meeting set the tone for what was to come. Imagine the scene. The American flag is raised. The soldiers parade in their finest uniforms, and Lewis and Clark, acting as official representatives of a new, distant government, step forward. Their mission, as dictated by President Jefferson, was not just to explore, but to establish trade and declare American sovereignty. A key part of their diplomatic strategy was the distribution of peace medals. These weren't just they were powerful symbols. On one side, you had the image of President Jefferson. On the other, two hands clasped in a handshake, above a tomahawk and a peace pipe. The message was clear. We come in peace, and our leader is now your great father. The chiefs who received the largest medals were recognized as the primary leaders, a gesture that sometimes unintentionally disrupted existing tribal power structures. Lewis would deliver a formal, carefully prepared speech, which would then be translated through a chain of interpreters, from English to French, and then into the specific tribal language. He spoke of a powerful new nation to the east, of a president who cared for his red children, and of the promise of trade and mutual protection. He would often end the ceremony by showcasing the might of American technology, firing the air gun, a state-of-the-art rifle that made no smoke and little noise, which often left the native onlookers in a state of awe and disbelief. These early encounters, like the one with the Oto and Missouri tribes at a site they named Council Bluffs, were filled with a mix of curiosity and caution on both sides. The tribes, for their part, were sizing up these newcomers. Were they a threat? A potential ally against their rivals? A new source of valuable goods, like guns, kettles, and tools? They often responded with speeches of their own, expressing their needs, their concerns, and their hopes for this new relationship. There were feasts, dances, and exchanges of gifts. The expedition offered tobacco, beads, and military coats. The tribes offered melons, corn, and buffalo meat, vital supplies that kept the corps moving forward. It was a time of learning. The journals of the expedition are filled with detailed observations of the customs, languages, and lifestyles of the people they met. They were fascinated by the Earth Lodge villagers, the intricate beadwork, and the horsemanship of the Plains warriors. However, not all encounters were so peaceful. As the expedition moved further north into the territory of the Teton Sioux, or Lakota, tensions escalated dramatically. The Lakota were the dominant power on this stretch of the Missouri, controlling trade and movement. They were not easily impressed by the Americans' medals or speeches. They saw the expedition not as diplomats, but as a challenge to their authority and a potential threat to their control over the river. Neowa is now Pierre, South Dakota. A tense standoff occurred. The Lakota demanded a toll for passage, a customary practice for anyone traveling through their territory. When the expedition refused, a confrontation nearly erupted into violence. According to the journals, warriors armed with bows and arrows surrounded the explorers, and for a few heart-stopping moments, it seemed a battle was inevitable. It was only through the calm intervention of a chief named Black Buffalo that bloodshed was avoided and the expedition was allowed to proceed. But the encounter left a lasting impression. It was a stark reminder that the West was not empty, and its inhabitants were not passive observers. These meetings were a constant balancing act. The expedition depended on the goodwill and knowledge of the native peoples for survival. They needed guides, food, and information about the path ahead. Every interaction was a negotiation, a test of trust, and a window into vastly different worldviews. Lewis and Clark were the first official representatives of the United States to meet many of these nations, and the precedents they set, both good and bad, would have consequences that echoed for generations. The expedition's journey up the Missouri was more than a geographic survey. It was a human drama played out on a continental scale. It was a series of first impressions, misunderstandings, and moments of genuine connection between peoples from opposite sides of the world, meeting for the first time on the banks of a wild and unforgiving river. As the leaves began to turn and the first bite of winter filled the air, the Corps knew they needed to find a safe place to wait out the harsh Dakota winter. Their journey had brought them to the doorstep of the Mandan and Hadatisa tribes, a bustling hub of agriculture and trade. The relationships they would forge here would be some of the most important of the entire expedition, and would introduce them to a person who would change the course of their journey forever. Sacagawea. But that's a story for our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explore the expeditionist Crusha first encounters with the native nations. It's a part of the story that is often simplified, but as you can see, it's incredibly rich and complex. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode where we settle in for the winter with the Mandan. We'll see you then. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're venturing into Chapter 7 of our journey. The harshness of the plains, leaving the familiar shadows of the forests behind. We stepped out into a world that felt impossibly vast, an endless ocean of grass under an immense, open sky. 4 days, the sun was our constant, relentless companion, beating down on us as we pushed westward. The horizon seemed to stretch into infinity, a shimmering line that we never seemed to get any closer to. It was a landscape of stark, minimalist beauty, but also one that demanded respect. You feel incredibly small out here, a tiny speck in an overwhelming emptiness. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass and the steady rhythm of our own footsteps. The first few days were a deceptive calm, a gentle introduction to the plains' true character. But we quickly learned that this tranquility was a mask. One afternoon, The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling towards us with an unnerving speed. The wind, once a gentle breeze, picked up, whipping the grasses into a frenzy. It carried the scent of rain and something else, a raw, electric charge. There was nowhere to hide, no shelter to be found. All we could do was brace ourselves. The storm hit us with the force of a physical blow. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry, dusty ground into a slick, treacherous mud. The temperature plummeted. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it felt like the sky itself was being torn apart, and lightning lit up the landscape in terrifying, brilliant flashes. We huddled together, trying to protect our gear and ourselves from the onslaught. The wind was a living thing, a howling beast that threatened to rip everything away. It was a visceral, humbling experience that stripped away any illusion of control. We weren't just observing nature. We were at its mercy. Surviving that first storm was a brutal but necessary lesson. It taught us that the plains were a land of extremes, where calm could turn to chaos in an instant. We had to be constantly vigilant, reading the sky, feeling the shift in the wind, and always being prepared for the worst. It forged a new level of respect in us for this environment. This wasn't just a place to pass through. It was a powerful entity that we had to learn to coexist with. But the weather wasn't the only challenge. The plains were teeming with life, and not all of it was friendly. Our first significant wildlife encounter happened at dusk, as the fading light painted the prairie in shades of orange and purple. We heard it before. We saw it, a long, mournful howl that echoed across the vast emptiness. Then another joined in, and another, until the air was filled with the chorus of a wolf pack. A shiver went down my spine. Seeing them was something else entirely. They moved like gray ghosts at the edge of our vision, their eyes catching the last light. They weren't aggressive, more curious and cautious, but their presence was a constant, unnerving reminder that we were intruders in their territory. We learned to build our fires bigger and brighter at night and to keep a vigilant watch, taking turns to ensure one of us was always awake. The wolves were intelligent, strategic hunters, and watching them from a distance was a masterclass in survival. But they weren't the only large predators we had to contend with. One morning, while scouting for a clean water source near a small creek, I came face to face with a grizzly bear. It was enormous, a mountain of muscle and fur, and it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Time seemed to stop. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be a fatal mistake. I froze, made myself look as large as possible, and slowly, carefully, began to back away, never breaking eye contact. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. The bear watched me, a low growl rumbling in its chest, before it turned and ambled away, disappearing into the tall grass as if it had never been there. That encounter left me shaken for days. It was a stark reminder of the food chain, and how precariously we were perched on it out here. And then there were the bison. You can't talk about the plains without talking about the bison. We first saw them as a dark, moving mass on the horizon. As we got closer, the sheer scale of the herd became apparent. It wasn't hundreds. It was thousands upon thousands of these magnificent creatures, a living, breathing river of life flowing across the prairie. The ground literally trembled under their hooves, and the air was filled with their deep, rumbling calls. It was one of the most awe-inspiring sights I've ever witnessed. They were the kings of this domain, a force of nature in their own right. We gave them a wide berth, understanding that despite their seemingly placid nature, a stampede could be catastrophic. Watching them felt like looking back in time, witnessing a world that was wild, untamed, and utterly magnificent. These encounters, the storms, the wolves, the bears, the bison, forced us to adapt. Our old survival strategies, honed in the woodlands, had to be completely Out here, shelter wasn't something you found. It was something you had to create from almost nothing. We learned to dig shallow trenches to protect ourselves from the wind and lightning during storms. We learned to read animal tracks, not just to hunt, but to know what was near us, and to avoid dangerous encounters. Fire became even more critical, not just for warmth and cooking, but as our primary line of defense against nocturnal predators. We became more attuned to the rhythms of the plains, rising with the sun and setting up camp long before dusk to secure our position for the night. Water was a constant concern. Unlike the forests with their abundant streams, water on the plains was scarce and unpredictable. We learned to spot the subtle signs that indicated its presence. Certain types of vegetation, the flight patterns of birds, the contours of the land. We became experts at conserving every single drop, understanding that our lives depended on it. Our diet changed, too. We learned to forage for edible prairie plants and became more proficient hunters, knowing that every calorie was precious fuel for the long journey ahead. This constant need to adapt sharpened our senses and our skills. We were no longer just passing through. We were becoming part of the landscape itself, learning its secrets, respecting its power, and finding our place within its harsh but beautiful embrace. Every day was a lesson in humility and resilience. The plains tested us physically, mentally, and emotionally. There were moments of despair, when the sheer scale of the landscape and the challenges it presented felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of profound beauty and connection. Watching a sunset that set the entire sky on fire, feeling the freedom of the wide open space, or successfully navigating a difficult situation, these moments filled us with a sense of accomplishment and a deep appreciation for the world around us. We were being forged in the crucible of the plains, stripped of our known, and discovering a strength within ourselves that we never knew we possessed. This chapter of our journey was brutal, but it was also transformative. It was teaching us what it truly means to survive. Thank you for joining me on this leg of the journey through the harshness of the plains. It's a chapter filled with challenges, but also with incredible growth and unforgettable moments. If you're enjoying this series and want to see what lies beyond the horizon, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. As always, stay curious, stay adventurous, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey, it's me. This is Book 8 of the Lewis and Clark Journals, Winter at Fort Mandan. They're building a fort in present-day North Dakota. It's the winter of 1804, 1805. They've left St. Louis in the fall of 1804, and after a very difficult journey up the Missouri River, they finally get to a place where there's enough level ground to build a fort. And they're going to spend the winter here and then continue their journey west in the spring. The first thing that they do when they get off the boats is go visit the local tribe. And they've got two tribes nearby, the Mandan and the Hidatsa. The Mandan are the ones who have the village right near the fort building site, and the Hidatsa are over on an island in the Missouri River. While the men are out visiting the Mandan, one of the Corps of Discovery had a fit of insanity and killed one of the Indians. And this was really bad because now they're stuck in a strange village with no friends, so they need to get these people back on their side. Lewis and Clark both go out and visit the chief and apologize for what happened, and they're able to smooth things over and establish good relations with the men. When they went to visit the Hidatsa didn't want to talk to them. They were so upset about what happened. But they did talk to the white man named Pompey. He was a French-Canadian who had been captured by the British and then escaped to the Hidatsa, and he's living in the Hidatsa village. He helps Lewis and Clark get the Hidatsa people back on their side as well. And while all this is going on, the soldiers are building a fort. They built a stockade, and they called it Fort Mandan. In fact, they named several places along the Missouri River after the various Native American tribes that they encountered, which is a nice touch. You can still find places today named after Native Americans that were around when Lewis and Clark went through. So they get the fort built just in time for winter. And it's not exactly winter when they get there. It's still pretty mild, but it's gonna get cold, and it does. Here's what it's like when winter hits. They had a fire in the center of the fort to keep the temperature up. But most nights the temperature gets below zero, and they have trouble keeping the fort warm. They're sleeping in shifts so that some of them can sleep while others keep the fire going. If they don't keep the fire going, the water pipes in their sleeping area will freeze and burst, and then they won't have any water. So it's important to keep the fire going. A lot of times, the best thing they can do is just huddle together for warmth, and they complain bitterly about the cold. But they also try to keep each other's spirits up. They tell stories and jokes and sing songs. They try to keep busy making toys for the Indian children and fixing equipment. And every once in a while, they have something good to eat. Like once they have a Christmas dinner with roasted goose, and that's about as good as it gets. But most of the time food is scarce, and they're mostly surviving on dried meat and fish. Now, you might think that sounds terrible, but they have some pretty good recipes for preparing dried meat. One of the recipes calls for cutting the dried meat into small pieces and then boiling it for a long time with roots and berries. Another recipe calls for pounding the dried meat until it has completely broken up and then mixing it with hot water and eating it with a spoon. I don't know. That doesn't sound too appetizing to me. Occasionally, they have some fresh meat. The soldiers hunt deer and buffalo, and they also have some cattle that they can kill and eat. There's a couple of canoes that were left behind from the cause of a discovery trip down the Missouri River, and those canoes have some corn and fresh vegetables in them. That's because when they came up the river, they brought some corn with them. They planted the corn, but it didn't do so well, so they took some of the corn back downriver with them when they left. They knew they could get more corn from the Native Americans, but the corn that they had planted wasn't doing so well, so that's why they took some back down the river, and that corn grew beautifully on the way downriver. And so when they returned in the spring, they would have plenty of fresh corn. And along with that, they bring some squash and pumpkins. The pumpkin seeds floated out of the canoe and grew along the banks of the river, so they have a few things to add some variety to their diet. One of the main things they eat is dried fish. They went out on the ice in the middle of the river and chopped holes in the ice, and they fished through these holes, and they caught some fish that way. And they also used nets to catch fish. And then they dried the fish by laying them out in the sun and wind. And the way they dried it made the fish very tough and very salty. So it wasn't good eating unless you had the right recipe for preparing it. They boiled it for a long time to make it tender, and they mixed in choke cherries and prairie turnips to add some flavor to it. It wasn't like eating a nice fresh fish, but it was definitely better than nothing. Sometimes they had a little bit of fresh fish. When they killed a buffalo, they would often eat the heart and the tongue raw. The tongue was a real treat for them, and sometimes they had some fresh meat from animals they hunted, and that was always a welcome change of pace. Now, everybody at the fort was getting tired of the same old, and they were hoping for some fresh vegetables, but their garden didn't do well during the winter. It was too cold. But in the early part of the spring, some of their seeds began to sprout, and that gave them hope that maybe their garden would do better in the spring and they would have some fresh vegetables to eat. In addition to food, they also had some entertainment. Most of the time, they just told stories and sang songs around the fire. That's what people did before Netflix, I guess. And they told stories about their trip so far, and they told stories about home. I imagine they told a lot of tall tales about what it was like back in the States. Who knows? Maybe they even told some ghost stories. That's always a favorite around the campfire. Every once in a while, they had a little excitement when one of the Indians would come running through the village screaming that the fort was being attacked. And of course, everybody would grab their rifle and run to the wall. And it turned out to be nothing. Turns out the attacks were coming from coyotes that were trying to steal their dogs. They tried to stay busy, and one way they did that was by playing games. They played checkers against each other, and they also played a game with a ball, kind of like volleyball, except they didn't call it that. Another way they kept busy was by working on projects. They were constantly fixing equipment, and they also made toys for the Indian children. They made a rocking horse for one of the chief's children, and they made a hoop for another child to play with. Some of the men worked on carving little wooden boats and ducks. These were probably more for entertainment than anything else. It was a way to pass the time. Another thing they did was trade with the Indians. They traded some beads and cloths for things like buffalo robes and dried meat, and they also traded with the Indians for horses. At one point, they had 8 horses, and these horses weren't just for riding around the fort. They needed horses to help them get around the country when they continued their journey. As the winter dragged on, the men got more and more restless. They were anxious to get moving again, and as the days got longer, they could see that spring was on the way, and they started planning for their departure. They were getting ready to go on the long journey west, and they knew that they wouldn't have much time to stop and rest. So they spent their last few weeks at the fort fixing equipment and making sure everything was in top shape. That brings us to the end of Chapter 8, Winter at Fort Mandan. Next time we'll pick up their story in Chapter 9, The Emmetsburg Mounds. And if you'd like to read along with the story, I've put a link to the book in the description below. Until next time, this is me. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Today, We're diving into Chapter 9, a pivotal moment when a remarkable young woman joins the Corps of Discovery and changes the course of their mission forever. As winter set in during late 1804, the expedition established Fort Mandan among the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples in what is now North Dakota. It was here, amidst the harsh cold and the need to prepare for the arduous journey ahead, that they encountered a man who would lead them to their most valuable human asset. His name was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader who had been living among the local tribes. He offered his services as an interpreter, but he wasn't the one who truly caught Lewis and Clark's attention. The captains were far more interested in his young, pregnant wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. Why her? Because Lewis and Clark knew their path would eventually lead them through the lands of the Shoshone, deep in the treacherous Rocky Mountains. To cross those mountains, they would need horses. And to get horses, they needed someone who could speak the language and negotiate with the tribe. Sacagawea was their key. Think about the situation from her perspective. She was only about 16 or 17 years old, had been captured from her Shoshone home years earlier, and was now living hundreds of miles away. She was married to Charbonneau, and was expecting her first child any day. An offer to join a massive expedition of American soldiers heading back towards her homeland must have been an incredible, perhaps even daunting, proposition. Yet, she agreed. The captains formally hired Charbonneau as an interpreter on November 4th, with the crucial understanding that Sacagawea would accompany him. They knew her value extended far beyond just her language skills. Sacagawea's knowledge was a treasure trove. Having grown up in the Rocky Mountain region, she possessed an intimate understanding of the geography that no map could provide. She knew the edible plants, the medicinal herbs, and the best routes to forage for food, skills that would prove essential in staving off starvation when the expedition's own supplies ran low. She was a living guide to the natural world of the West. Furthermore, her ability to communicate with the Shoshone was indispensable. While Charbonneau spoke French and Hidatsa, he didn't speak Shoshone. The chain of communication was complex. Sacagawea would speak Shoshone to a Hidatsa-speaking person, who would then translate to Charbonneau in Hidatsa, and Charbonneau would finally translate into French for one of the expedition members, who could then translate it into English for the captains. It was cumbersome, but it worked, and it was all thanks to her. Then, on February 11th, 1805, amidst the freezing Dakota winter at Fort Mandan, another member joined the expedition. Sacagawea gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Captain Lewis himself assisted with the delivery. T's tiny baby, affectionately nicknamed Pomp, or Pompey, by Captain Clark, meaning firstborn in the Shoshone language, would become the youngest explorer in the Corps of Discovery. Imagine the scene. A group of rugged soldiers, explorers, and frontiersmen, now with a newborn baby in their midst. His presence had a profound and unexpected impact on the expedition. When the expedition set out again in the spring of 1805, Sacagawea was there, carrying Jean-Baptiste on her back in a cradleboard. Her presence, along with her baby, served an unintended but vital purpose. To the Native American tribes they encountered, a war party would never travel with a woman and a child. Seeing Sacagawea and little Pomp immediately signaled that the Corps of Discovery came in peace. She was a walking, talking symbol of their non-hostile intentions, opening doors and easing tensions in ways that no weapon or diplomat ever could. She helped build bridges of trust with tribes who were rightfully wary of outsiders. Her quiet strength and resilience were evident every single day. One famous incident perfectly illustrates her calm and quick thinking. In May 1805, a sudden squall hit their pirogue, a type of large canoe, on the Missouri River. The boat, steered at the time by her husband Charbonneau, who panicked in the storm, nearly capsized, as precious supplies, including the captain's priceless journals, books, and navigational instruments, were washed overboard. It was Sacagawea who calmly reached into the churning water, securing and rescuing the vital items that would otherwise have been lost forever. The captains were so impressed that they later named a river in her honor, calling it Sacagawea, or Birdwoman River. She had proven her worth time and time again, not just as an interpreter, but as a steadfast and resourceful member of the team. As they pushed deeper into the unknown, heading toward the formidable Rocky Mountains, Sacagawea's role became even more critical. She began recognizing landmarks from her childhood, confirming they were on the right path to her people's territory. This was the moment the captains had been waiting for. They desperately needed to find the Shoshone to acquire the horses that were their only hope of crossing the Continental Divide before the winter snows trapped them. Without Sacagawea, they would have been navigating blind, relying solely on guesswork and hope. She was their compass, their connection to the land and its people. The addition of Sacagawea and her son, Jean Baptiste, transformed the expedition. She wasn't just a guide or an interpreter. She was a provider, a diplomat, and a symbol of peace. Her knowledge of the land kept the men fed. Her presence calmed potentially hostile encounters, and her level-headedness saved the very records of their journey. As we'll see in our next chapter, her journey was about to come full circle in a reunion. So incredible it seems like something out of a novel. The young Shoshone woman, taken from her home years ago, was about to lead this band of explorers right back to her own people. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of the story. The tale of Sacagawea is one of incredible courage and importance, and it's a crucial part of American history. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where the expedition finally reaches the Rocky Mountains. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of the Lewis and Clark expedition. We've traveled thousands of miles, and now we stand at a critical juncture. Chapter 10: The Daunting Struggles in the Rocky Mountains. If you've missed any part of our adventure, be sure to catch up on the playlist. Now, let's dive into one of the most challenging chapters of their entire journey. By August 1805, the cause of discovery had finally reached the headwaters of the Missouri River. Imagine their mixed emotions. For months, they had battled the river's relentless current, believing it would lead them to a simple portage, short walk to the Columbia River system and a downstream float to the Pacific. They had reached the source, a monumental achievement in itself. Captain Lewis stood with one foot on each side of the trickling stream that would become the mighty Missouri. It was a symbolic moment, but it was overshadowed by a terrifying reality. Instead of the gentle, rolling hills they had hoped for, a seemingly endless sea of snow-capped peaks rose before them. The Rocky Mountains. There was no easy water route. Their dream of a Northwest Passage was shattered. The expedition's success, and their very survival, now depended on finding a way through this formidable barrier before the brutal mountain winter trapped them completely. Their supplies were dwindling, the men were exhausted, and the clock was ticking. Just as despair began to set in, a stroke of unbelievable fortune occurred. Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman traveling with the expedition, began to recognize landmarks. This was her home. She had been captured from this very valley years ago. The relief that must have flooded through the captains is hard to overstate. Her knowledge wasn't just helpful, it was their lifeline. She knew the land, the people, and the paths. Her presence had just become the single most important asset to the entire expedition. Soon, they made contact with a band of Shoshone. The tension was palpable. Lewis and Clark desperately needed horses to cross the mountains, and these were the first people they had encountered who could provide them. Negotiations began, a delicate dance of diplomacy and trade. But then, in a scene that feels straight out of a Hollywood movie, Sacagawea recognized the chief. It was her brother, Kamehameha. Imagine that reunion. Tears, astonishment, and a flood of emotion. After years of separation and hardship, a brother and sister were reunited in the middle of nowhere, their meeting altering the course of American history. This wasn't just a personal moment. It was the diplomatic breakthrough the expedition desperately needed. Thanks to this incredible family connection, the Shoshone agreed to trade for horses. They provided not just the animals, but also crucial advice about the treacherous paths ahead. They warned of a route so difficult that even they rarely used it. But it was the only way forward. With about 30 horses and a Shoshone guide named Old Toby, the Corps prepared for the most grueling leg of their journey. They were about to enter the Bitterroot Mountains, a rugged sub-range of the Rockies. Old Toby pointed them toward the Lolo Trail, a winding, difficult path that promised a shortcut to the other side. What they didn't know was that they were attempting this passage far too late in the season. Winter was arriving early in the high country. The ordeal began almost immediately. The trail was narrow, steep, and confusing. It clung to the sides of steep canyons and wound through dense, dark forests. The weather turned against them with a vengeance. What started as a cold rain quickly turned to sleet, and then to heavy, blinding snow. The men, dressed in worn-out leather and moccasins, were completely unprepared for the freezing temperatures and deep snowdrifts. Their feet were cut and bleeding on the sharp rocks hidden beneath the snow. Food became the primary, all-consuming obsession. The game they had relied on in the plains was nowhere to be found in these high, desolate mountains. They were starving. To survive, they had to kill and eat some of their own horses. A decision that must have been heartbreaking after the effort it took to acquire them. Even the horses were weakening, slipping on the icy trails and struggling to find anything to eat. The men were reduced to eating a few cans of portable soup, candles made from animal fat, and even the leather from their shoes. Morale plummeted. The men were freezing, starving, and on the brink of collapse. Clark wrote in his journal, "I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Sickness and frostbite became constant companions." They were lost, disoriented in the snow-covered landscape, and their guide, old Toby, even lost the trail at one point. For 11 days, they struggled through this frozen hell. It seemed like the mountains were trying to swallow them whole. It was the lowest point of the entire expedition. Just when it seemed they could go on no longer, Captain Clark took a small advance party and pushed ahead, desperate to find food and a way out. After a few agonizing days, he stumbled out of the mountains and into a valley. There, he found a village of the Nez Perce people. The Nez Perce were wary at first, but they showed incredible kindness, sharing their food-dried salmon and camas roots with the starving explorers. When Clark's party didn't return immediately, Lewis and the rest of the corps feared the worst. But soon, the Nez Perce, guided by Clark's party, arrived with food and fresh horses. They had made it. They had crossed the Rocky Mountains. The sight of the friendly faces and the taste of food must have felt like a miracle. They were skeletal, sick, and exhausted, but they were alive. They had survived the bitter. This chapter of their journey is a raw testament to human endurance and the sheer will to survive. It was a trial by ice and starvation that pushed every member of the Corps of Discovery to their absolute limit. They had faced the worst the continent could throw at them and had emerged on the other side, ready to continue their push to the Pacific. Thank you for joining us for this intense part of the story. The courage and resilience shown in the Rockies is truly inspiring. If you found this chapter as gripping as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We've crossed the Great Divide, and the Pacific Ocean is now within reach. We'll see you in the next episode, as the journey continues down the Columbia River. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, history adventurers. We're diving headfirst into Chapter 11 of our epic journey. With the formidable Rocky Mountains now behind us, a new phase of the expedition begins, and it's all about one mighty river, the Columbia. Our intrepid explorers are now in the hands of new, indispensable allies, the Nez Perce. These guides aren't just showing them a path. They're sharing generations of knowledge about the land, the water, and the quickest, safest routes to the Pacific. This partnership marks a crucial shift, a moment of cultural exchange and mutual reliance that will define this entire leg of the journey. The Corps of Discovery is learning to see the West not as an empty wilderness to be conquered, but as a vibrant, populated homeland. The Nez Perce lead them to the Clearwater River, where a monumental task awaits: building canoes. The massive ponderosa pines that tower over the riverbanks become the raw material for their new fleet. Imagine the scene: the crisp autumn air filled with the rhythmic thud of axes and the slow, deliberate process of hollowing out these giant logs using controlled fire and hand tools. It's a race against time. Winter is approaching, and every day spent on the riverbank is a day they re-nod moving closer to their goal. Finally, the canoes are ready. They launch onto the Clearwater, which soon flows into the Snake River, and then, at last, into the mighty Columbia. But this isn't a leisurely paddle. The river is a beast, a churning corridor of treacherous rapids with names that would send a shiver down anyone's spine. The expedition members, many of whom are not experienced boatmen, must navigate these dangerous passages. Water crashes over the sides of their dugout canoes, threatening to swamp them and send their precious supplies and themselves into the icy depths. It's a constant battle of skill, strength, and sheer nerve. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, could spell disaster. They portage around the most violent sections, carrying tons of gear and the heavy canoes themselves over sharp, rocky terrain. It's exhausting, back-breaking work. But through it all, they persevere, their eyes fixed westward, driven by the promise of the Pacific Ocean. Yet, amid the danger, there is incredible abundance. The Columbia River is teeming with life. The water is so thick with salmon returning to spawn that it seems you could almost walk across their backs. This isn't just a spectacle, it's survival. The explorers witnessed the incredible fishing techniques of the local tribes, who have built elaborate wooden platforms out over the rapids to spear and net the fish. The expedition's diet changes dramatically. Gone are the days of hunting elk and deer. Now, it's salmon, and more salmon. They buy vast quantities from the riverside villages, drying it for the journey ahead. They also encounter new foods, like pounded salmon, meal, and roots, generously offered by the native people they meet along the riverbanks. This abundance is a lifeline, replenishing their strength and spirits after the arduous mountain crossing. The landscape itself is transforming before their very eyes. The forested mountains give way to a vast, treeless plain. It's a stark, beautiful, and alien environment. The river has carved a deep canyon through the basalt rock, and for miles in every direction, there's nothing but rolling hills and open sky. This geological wonder tells a story of ancient volcanic flows and the immense power of water over millennia. For the explorers, it's yet another reminder of the sheer scale and diversity of the American continent. They float past village after village, each a center of trade and culture. The Columbia River isn't an empty highway. It's the heart of a bustling network of communities. The sight of these strangers, the first white men most have ever seen, causes a stir. Some encounters are cautious. Others are filled with curiosity and warm hospitality. Clark, with his red hair, becomes a figure of particular fascination. These meetings are a delicate dance of diplomacy, sign language, and the exchange of gifts, blue beads and peace medals for salmon and guidance. The sheer volume of wildlife is astounding. Besides the endless salmon, the river is home to seals, who have traveled hundreds of miles inland from the ocean. This is a thrilling sign for the expedition. The salty air of the Pacific can't be far now. Flocks of geese, ducks, and cranes are so dense they sometimes darken the sky. The river is a living, breathing entity, a source of both peril and profound plenty. As they navigate the final set of major rapids, the Cascades of the Columbia, the air begins to change. There's a new scent on the wind, a dampness, a saltiness that quickens the pulse. The river widens, and the tides begin to influence its flow. The long, grueling journey is nearing its end. The goal they have dreamed of for over a year and a half is almost within reach. The anticipation is palpable. After thousands of miles of struggle and discovery, they are about to lay their eyes on the Pacific Ocean. The final push is on. What an incredible chapter in this journey. From the guidance of the Nez Perce to the heart-pounding rapids and the life-giving abundance of the Columbia. It's a story of resilience and adaptation. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of the adventure. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the grand finale. We'll see you next time.
Hello, history adventurers, and welcome back to our epic journey across the American continent. If you've been following along, you know the cause of discovery has endured incredible hardships, navigated treacherous rivers, and crossed the formidable Rocky Mountains. After a year and a half of relentless travel, the moment they've been dreaming of is finally within reach. Today, we're diving into Chapter 12, Arrival at the Pacific Ocean. Picture this, it's early November, 1805. The air is thick with mist and the constant, chilling rain of the Pacific Northwest. The expedition is battered, their clothes are rotting, and they are exhausted. They've been paddling down the mighty Columbia River, a powerful current pushing them westward. Every bend in the river teases them with the promise of the sea. They can smell the salt in the air, feel the change in the breeze, and hear a distant, thunderous roar that isn't a waterfall. Then, on November 7th, Captain Clark, ever the optimist, scrawls in his journal the triumphant words, "Ocean in view." Oh, the joy! Can you imagine the sheer elation, the wave of relief and accomplishment that must have washed over every single member of the Corps? After traveling over 4,000 miles through an unknown wilderness, they had done it. They had reached the Pacific Ocean, fulfilling one of the primary objectives of their mission. But their celebration was short-lived. The view Clark saw was actually the vast, tidally influenced estuary of the Columbia River. Ferocious storms, whipping up massive waves, pinned them down for nearly 3 weeks in a miserable, exposed cove. They were trapped between a rocky shoreline and a raging, impassable body of water. Food was scarce, their shelters were inadequate, and the constant dampness was a real threat to their health and morale. This wasn't the idyllic coastal paradise they might have imagined. It was a brutal introduction to the harsh Pacific winter. Realizing they couldn't stay where they were, the captains needed to make a critical decision: where to spend the winter. They needed a location with ample game for hunting, friendly relations with local tribes for trade, and protection from the relentless coastal storms. In a truly remarkable and democratic moment for the era, the decision was put to a vote. Every member of the expedition, including York, Clark's enslaved man, and Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who had been indispensable to their journey, was given a say. This vote is a landmark event in American history, a profound example of inclusivity in an otherwise rigidly hierarchical time. The group decided to cross to the southern side of the Columbia River. After scouting the area, they chose a site near a small river that offered access to elk herds and was elevated enough to be safe from flooding. Here, amidst towering forests of hemlock and spruce, they began the arduous task of building their winter home. Working tirelessly in the cold, wet conditions, they felled trees and constructed a sturdy log fortress. By Christmas Day, 1805, they were moving into their newly completed shelter, which they named Fort Clatsop in honor of the local Clatsop tribe. Fort Clatsop wasn't just a shelter, it was a scientific outpost. The winter of 1805 to 1806 was a period of intense work and documentation. While the rain fell almost ceaselessly, they recorded only 12 days without rain during their 4-month stay. Their expedition was anything but idle. Lewis and Clark set about organizing the mountain of information they had collected. They updated their maps, refined their celestial observations to calculate their exact longitude and latitude, and painstakingly detailed their journals. Lewis, the passionate naturalist, focused on the incredible biodiversity of the Pacific coast. He described new species of plants like the Oregon grape and the salal berry, and animals such as the massive California condor and the majestic Roosevelt elk. He documented the life cycles of salmon, a crucial food source for the region's native peoples. His detailed descriptions and sketches were creating the first scientific record of the flora and fauna of the American West. Meanwhile, Clark, the masterful cartographer and ethnographer, concentrated on mapping the coastline and documenting the cultures of the local tribes, including the Clatsop Chinook and Tillamook peoples. He described their plank houses, their masterful cedar canoes, their unique trading practices, and their social structures. The Corps established a salt-making camp on the coast, where a small detachment boiled seawater around the clock to produce the precious preservative, a vital commodity for their return journey. Life at Fort Clatsop was monotonous and challenging. The diet consisted mainly of elk, which was often spoiled due to the damp climate, supplemented with fish and roots traded from their native neighbors. The men battled fleas, sickness, and the psychological toll of the constant gloom and confinement. Yet, their discipline held. They maintained their routines, stood guard, and prepared for the long, arduous journey back east. Their time on the Pacific coast was a testament to their resilience and unwavering commitment to their mission. They had found a direct water route to the Pacific's the Northwest Passage, but they had achieved something far greater. They had forged a path across the continent, established relations with dozens of Native American nations, and opened a window into a world previously unknown to the young United States. The winter at Fort Clatsop was the final, crucial chapter of their westward push, a time of consolidation and preparation before turning their faces homeward. As spring approached in March 1806, the members of the Corps of Discovery packed their belongings, presented Fort Clatsop as a gift to the local Clatsop chief, and began their epic journey back home. They left behind not just a log fort, but a legacy of discovery, endurance, and a wealth of knowledge that would change the face of America forever. Thank you so much for joining us on this leg of the journey. The story is far from over, as the return trip presents its own set of incredible challenges and adventures. If you enjoyed this video and want to follow the Corps of Discovery back across the continent, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you with us on this historical exploration. See you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Lewis and Clark expedition. We've journeyed with the Corps of Discovery all the way to the Pacific Ocean, a monumental achievement. But getting there was only half the battle. Now, they faced the daunting task of returning home, a journey that would prove to be just as perilous, if not more so, than the one that brought them west. This is Chapter 13, a difficult return journey, as the wet, dreary winter of 1805 at Fort Clatsop finally drew to a close. The expedition was more than ready to leave. Supplies were dangerously low. Their leather clothing was rotting in the damp climate, and everyone was sick of the constant rain and the diet of elk meat. On March 23, 1806, Lewis and Clark gave the order. The Corps of Discovery turned their backs on the Pacific and began the long, arduous trek east. Their goal was to make it back to the Mandan villages before the next winter set in. Their initial plan was to retrace their steps over the Bitterroot Mountains. However, when they reached the homeland of the Nez Perce people in May, they encountered a major obstacle: snow. The mountain passes they had struggled through on their way west were still buried under 10 to 15 feet of snow, making them completely impassable. The Nez Perce warned them it would be at least another month before the snow melted enough to cross. This delay was frustrating, but it also presented an opportunity. During their extended stay with the Nez Perce, the men rested, traded for horses, and regained their strength. The captains used this time to plan a bold new strategy for the return journey. Instead of staying together, the expedition would split into smaller groups to cover more ground and explore new territory. This decision was a calculated risk. It would allow them to map vast, unknown areas, but it would also stretch their resources thin and leave the smaller parties more vulnerable. Once the snows finally receded enough in late June, the plan was set in motion. The entire corps crossed the Bitterroots together, but on the other side, on Hulitre-Seride, they parted ways. Captain Lewis would lead a group north, following a shortcut to the Great Falls of the Missouri River. From there, he planned to explore the Marias River, hoping to determine if its headwaters extended north into British territory, which would have significant implications for trade and territorial claims. Meanwhile, Captain Clark would take the main party south. His mission was to retrieve the canoes and supplies they had cached at the headwaters of the Jefferson River. After that, he would lead his group overland to the Yellowstone River, build new canoes, and follow it all the way to its confluence with the Missouri. Sergeant John Ordway was tasked with leading a small detachment down the Jefferson and Missouri rivers to reunite with Lewis's cached supplies at the Great Falls. It was a complex, multi-pronged exploration plan, a testament to the captain's confidence and ambition. Lewis's journey north quickly became the most dramatic and dangerous leg of the entire expedition. With him were 3 of his best men: George Drouillard and the Field brothers, Joseph and Reuben. After reaching the Great Falls and having Ordway's group begin the grueling portage, Lewis and his small team headed north to the Marias River. This was Blackfeet territory, a powerful and notoriously wary tribe. For days, they saw signs of the Blackfeet, but no people. Then, on July 26th, near what is now Coot Bank Montaigne, their luck ran out. They encountered a small party of 8 Blackfeet warriors. Initially, the meeting was tense but peaceful. Lewis, following protocol, presented them with a medal and a flag, communicating through Drouillard's sign language. They agreed to camp together for the night, but the atmosphere was fraught with suspicion. Lewis knew this encounter could turn violent at any moment. The Blackfeet were interested in the expedition's guns and horses, items that were essential for Lewis's party's survival. During the night, Lewis's fears were realized. As the men stood guard, the Blackfeet tried to steal their rifles and horses. A struggle ensued. In the chaotic moments that followed, Reuben Field managed to stab one of the warriors, while Lewis, in a desperate attempt to stop another from escaping with his horse and gun, shot and killed him. It was a tragic, violent confrontation, the only one of its kind during the entire Tuandahafia journey. Knowing that a much larger Blackfeet war party was likely nearby, Lewis and his men made a frantic escape. They rode for nearly 24 hours straight, covering an astonishing 120 miles before they felt safe enough to rest. They galloped southward, pushing themselves and their horses to the absolute limit. Their desperate flight finally ended when they reached the Missouri River and, by a stroke of incredible luck, intercepted the canoes coming downriver with Sergeant Ordway and the rest of the party from the Great Falls. They were safe, but the encounter left a dark mark on the expedition's otherwise peaceful record of relations with native tribes. While Lewis was dealing with danger in the north, Clark's journey down the Yellowstone was a study in contrasts. His group, which included Sacagawea and her son, Jean Baptiste, had its own share of hardships, but faced them with remarkable resilience. After crossing the Bozeman Pass, they reached the Yellowstone River. They felled cottonwood trees and constructed 2 large dugout canoes, lashing them together for stability. The trip down the Yellowstone was relatively swift. The river's current carried them quickly through a landscape rich with wildlife. They saw vast herds of bison, so numerous they sometimes had to wait for them to cross the river. They also encountered grizzly bears, which continued to be a terrifying menace. One night, a grizzly charged into their camp, and only the quick thinking of Clark's enslaved man, York, and the barking of the dog Seaman saved them from disaster. But Clark's journey wasn't just about survival. It was also about discovery. On July 25th, he carved his name and the date into a massive sandstone formation along the riverbank, which ennobled Pompey's tower after Sacagawea's son, whose nickname was Pomp. This inscription is one of the few physical pieces of evidence of the expedition that still exists today. It's a tangible link to their epic journey, a simple signature on a rock that speaks volumes about their presence in this wild, untamed land. Finally, on August 12, 1806, near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, the divided parties were reached. Lewis and Ordway's group, having raced down the Missouri, met up with Clark's party. The reunion was a joyous one, a moment of immense relief. They had done it. They had successfully explored hundreds of miles of new territory, mapped 2 major river systems, and all returned safely. Well, almost. Lewis had been accidentally shot in the thigh by one of his own men during a hunting accident a few days prior, a painful but not life-threatening wound. With the cores of discovery now whole again, the final leg of their journey began. They paddled swiftly down the Missouri, the current now their powerful ally. They stopped briefly at the Mandan villages to drop off Sacagawea, her husband San Charbonneau, and their son, Little Pomp. It was a bittersweet farewell. Sacagawea had been an invaluable member of the expedition, a guide, an interpreter, and a symbol of peace. Clark, who had grown incredibly fond of her son, offered to raise and educate him, an offer they would accept years later. From there, it was a race to the finish. The men, eager to return to their homes and families, paddled relentlessly. They passed familiar landmarks, places where they had toiled and struggled on their way upriver 2 years before. Now, with the river's help, they covered in a day what had once taken them a week. The sense of anticipation must have been electrifying. On September 23rd, 1806, after more than 2 years and 4 months and over 8,000 miles, the cores of discovery paddled into St. Louis. The townspeople, who had long given them up for dead, were stunned. Cheers erupted from the riverbanks as the weathered buckskin-clad explorers came ashore. They were heroes. They had crossed a continent and returned with a treasure trove of knowledge maps, scientific specimens, and detailed journals that would reshape America's understanding of its own land. Their difficult return journey was over, and their incredible legacy was just beginning. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of their return is a powerful reminder that the end of a journey is often just as challenging as the beginning. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of our series on the Lewis and Clark expedition. We'll see you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Lewis and Clark expedition. We've journeyed with the cores of discovery across thousands of miles of untamed wilderness, and now we've reached the final, triumphant chapter of their epic story, the return home. Imagine the scene. It's September 1806. The men, weathered and lean from 2.5 years of relentless travel, finally see the familiar outline of civilization on the horizon. After surviving harsh winters, navigating treacherous rivers, and negotiating with dozens of Native American tribes, they are about to complete one of the most audacious journeys in American history. The sense of relief and accomplishment must have been absolutely overwhelming as their canoes sliced through the waters of the Missouri River, approaching the bustling outpost of St. Louis. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire. The town, which had long given them up for dead, erupted in a joyous frenzy. People poured out of their homes and businesses, lining the riverbanks, their cheers echoing across the water. The expedition, once a small, determined group heading into the unknown, had returned as legendary figures, as national heroes. The celebration was immediate and heartfelt. St. Louis threw a grand welcome for the Corps. Feasts were held, toasts were made, and the men were hailed for their incredible perseverance. They were no longer just soldiers and frontiersmen. They were living symbols of American courage and ambition. Can you imagine the stories they told that night? Tales of grizzly bears, vast prairies, teeming with bison, and towering snow-capped mountains that touched the sky. They spoke of the Pacific Ocean, a sight most Americans could only dream of, and of the diverse cultures they had encountered along the way. For Meriwether, Lewis, and William Clark, the return was more than just a personal victory. It marked the successful completion of a monumental task assigned to them by President Thomas Jefferson himself. Their primary mission had been to find a water route to the Pacific, and while they discovered that no such easy passage existed, what they brought back was arguably far more valuable. Carefully packed and protected throughout their perilous journey were their priceless journals. These weren't just simple diaries. They were exhaustive records of everything they had seen and experienced. Page after page was filled with detailed observations of the landscape, meticulous notes on the flora and fauna they encountered, and crucial information about the Native American tribes, their languages, customs, and political structures. The scientific data they collected was groundbreaking, introducing hundreds of new plant and animal species to the Western world. And then there were the maps. Clark, a gifted cartographer, had painstakingly charted their route. Before their expedition, the American West was largely a blank space on the map, a realm of myth and speculation. Now, thanks to Clark's incredible skill, the nation had its first detailed, reliable map of the Louisiana Territory and the lands beyond, stretching all the way to the Pacific coast. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a key that would unlock the West for future generations of pioneers, traders, and settlers. The journey to deliver these treasures to President Jefferson in Washington, D.C. was the final leg of their mission. Lewis, carrying the precious documents, traveled east. When he finally presented the maps, journals, and scientific specimens to Jefferson, it was the culmination of a dream. Jefferson, a man of science and vision, could now see the vast potential of the continent laid out before him. The information provided by the expedition would shape American policy and fuel westward expansion for decades to come. The members of the Corps of Discovery received their pay double the standard rate for their extraordinary service and land grants as a reward. They began to reintegrate into the society they had left behind, each man forever changed by the experience. Some, like John Coulter, were so captivated by the wilderness that they soon returned to the mountains to live as trappers. Others settled down, started families, and shared their incredible stories, which became the stuff of American legend. William Clark went on to have a distinguished career as the governor of the Missouri Territory and superintendent of Indian Affairs, using the knowledge and relationships he had built during the expedition to navigate the complex dynamics of the frontier. His legacy is one of diplomacy and administration. For Meriwether Lewis, the path was more tragic. Despite being named governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, he struggled to adjust to life after the expedition. The immense pressures of his new role, coupled with personal challenges, weighed heavily on him. His life ended under mysterious circumstances just a few years after his heroic return, a somber note in an otherwise triumphant story. It's a poignant reminder that even the greatest heroes face their own internal battles, and we should always approach stories of mental struggle with compassion and understanding. So, as we close this chapter, let's reflect on the incredible legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They didn't just cross a continent, they expanded the mind and imagination of a nation. They faced the unknown with courage, documented it with scientific precision, and returned as heroes who had redrawn the map of America. Their journey is a testament to the power of human curiosity, endurance, and the unyielding spirit of discovery. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. If you've enjoyed this series, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next historical adventure. We love hearing from you, so please drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.
Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we've reached the final chapter of an incredible saga, the legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition. What did this monumental journey truly leave behind? It's a story far more complex and impactful than just a trek across a continent. So, let's dive into the enduring legacy of the cause of discovery. First and foremost, the expedition was a triumph of cartography and science. Before Lewis and Clark, the American West was largely a blank space on the map, filled with myth and speculation. The cause meticulously charted the course of major rivers like the Missouri and the Columbia, creating the first reliable maps of this vast territory. Imagine, for the first time, having a clear picture of the waterways that would become the arteries of westward expansion. These maps weren't just lines on paper. They were the keys to unlocking the continent, guiding future trappers, traders, and pioneers. Their detailed journals provided an invaluable blueprint of the West, transforming it from a mysterious unknown into a tangible, navigable landscape. But the legacy wasn't just about geography. It was also a monumental scientific undertaking. Guided by President Thomas Jefferson's insatiable curiosity, the expedition was tasked with documenting everything they encountered, and they delivered spectacularly. The cause of discovery catalogued hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to American science, from the formidable grizzly bear to the nimble pronghorn, from the prairie dog to the coyote. Their journals introduced a new world of fauna to the east. They described and collected specimens of plants like the bitterroot and the ponderosa pine, expanding the botanical knowledge of the time immensely. This wasn't just a sightseeing trip. It was a mobile scientific laboratory, laying the groundwork for the study of Western ecosystems for generations to come. Their detailed observations provided a baseline snapshot of the American West's pristine natural environment, a resource that remains invaluable to scientists even today. Of course, no discussion of the expedition's legacy is complete without honoring the incredible role of Sacagawea. She joined the Corps as a young woman with her infant son, and her presence proved to be indispensable. Her knowledge of the land and its edible plants was vital for the survival of the group. More than that, her skills as a translator and diplomat were crucial in navigating the complex web of Native American relations. In a time of tension and uncertainty, the sight of a woman and a baby traveling with the party was a universal sign of peace, signaling to the tribes they encountered that this was not a war party. Sacagawea's reunion with her Shoshone family was a pivotal moment, directly leading to the Corps obtaining the horses they desperately needed to cross the treacherous Rocky Mountains. Her strength, resilience, and quiet dignity have made her an enduring symbol not just of the expedition, but of female courage and the vital contributions of Native Americans to American history. Her legacy is a powerful reminder that this journey was a collaborative effort, impossible without the help and knowledge of the continent's original inhabitants. The most sweeping, and perhaps most complicated, legacy of the expedition was the opening of the American West. The path blazed by Lewis and Clark became a beacon for others to follow. Fur trappers and traders, the famed mountain men, were hot on their heels, using the expedition's maps and knowledge to exploit the region's rich resources. Soon after, waves of settlers, missionaries, and pioneers began to push westward, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity that the expedition had revealed. The journey effectively fired the starting gun for the era of manifest destiny, fueling the national belief in a coast-to-coast American empire. The Louisiana Purchase was no longer an abstract acquisition. It was a real, accessible, and desirable frontier. The expedition transformed the idea of America, stretching its horizons and its ambitions all the way to the Pacific Ocean. However, this legacy is a double-edged sword. While the expedition fulfilled Jefferson's scientific and expansionist dreams, it also marked the beginning of immense pressure on the native nations of the West. The detailed reports on the land and its resources, intended for scientific and commercial purposes, also served as a roadmap for future displacement. The arrival of the Corps was the leading edge of a wave that would, over the next century, profoundly and often tragically alter the lives of the native peoples they had met. The opening of the West for American settlers meant the closing of a way of life for countless others. It's a crucial part of the story to remember. The expedition was not just an end, but also the beginning of a new and difficult chapter in the relationship between the United States and the sovereign native nations whose lands they had traversed. The legacy includes both the triumph of discovery and the seeds of future conflict and sorrow. So, as we close this chapter, we see that the legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition is rich, layered, and multifaceted. It was a journey of scientific discovery that unveiled the natural wonders of a continent, It was a feat of exploration that redrew the map of America and redefined its destiny. It was a human story of endurance, cooperation, and the remarkable contributions of individuals like Sacagawea. But it was also the harbinger of immense change, setting in motion forces that would reshape the West and the lives of its inhabitants forever. The echoes of their footsteps on that long trail to the Pacific can still be felt today in the names of rivers and mountains, in the scientific understanding of our environment, and in the complex ongoing story of the American West. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible historical journey. It has been a privilege to explore this epic tale with all of you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you next time.